The girl had a duffel bag under her bed, which was empty. Quick as I could, I dumped her laptop, comic books, and most of her dresser into. From the closet, I packed up a bunch of clothes. If her house was gonna burn down, which I assumed was sure to happen based on the smoke already scenting the air, I wanted her to have at least some of her stuff saved afterwards. Teenagers are already in a state of flux, literally just because they're teenagers. A teenage girl who thinks she's Nancy goddamn Drew, getting herself into some hardcore nonsense that might get her folks killed, whose house then burns down. I think that might actually be what is in the dictionary if you look up the word flux. Though, I was thinking. A cult coming after a rich girl. The idea of this guy she talked about having a group of older people that trusted him. I got the feeling that maybe it was all some kind of con, and she was the target, her family, because of their money. The question was, why would she be a target if no ransom was sent? I was out of time. Too many questions were left that I had counted on asking the parents once they got themselves separated and calmed down after the initial interview. The blood-curdling scream could have been the wife, or either the maids or the cooks. Hell, it could have been any other staff I just didn't goddamn know about. It was a big, mansion-y house. Too many goddamn variables, I muttered, sprinting through the door and drawing the 10mm semi-automatic pistol from my underarm holster. Patted my long coat pocket and got the extra magazines. See, the gun was big and old, a custom job that I had put together for me by an old friend who likely either wasn't alive anymore, or whom records would show never existed in the first place. 20 rounds, long barrel, with a customized and specialized compensator matched exactly to the shape of the slide because I do like consistency when I can have it. Integrated laser sight, it was a gun made for hunting. Generally people. I might have disappeared back in the day, left New York for good, left the old life. But hell, there was no way I could leave my cannon behind. We'd been through too much together. I took the time to work the compensator off and screw on the suppressor, load in a new magazine with subsonic ammunition, and cycle the action to get one in the chamber. Out in the hall, my boots squeaked on the hardwood floor. Smoke was billowing up the stairs at the end of said hall, rushing towards the cathedral ceiling on currents of hot air. I got lucky on that one. The high ceilings were a small benefit early on if there was a house fire. At least they seemed to be in that instance. That meant it would take a little bit for the air to get too hazy. Even so, I could feel the beginnings of the stings of smoke in the back of my throat. I ducked into the office next door, where I assumed the wife still was, and I found that I was already too late. I didn't know how. I didn't know how someone could have gotten in there without me noticing. I usually feel things like that. Or hear them, or I don't know. I just don't know. Or at least I didn't back then. The father was on his back on the floor. At least I had to assume it was the father. It sort of made me flash back to somewhere that I used to be when I was someone else. The stink of burnt hair that dredged up ugly memories for a moment as my eyes tracked to the mother's corpse. Adrenaline flooded me. Training asserted itself and my feet started moving. The mother and father were burnt to ash like human-shaped pieces of charcoal, barely recognizable. I started circling around the center of the room, as the maid in the corner was bathed in fire. She was the one screaming. A man stood in front of me, a man in a black turtleneck, I'm not joking, and a balaclava. He had his tattooed, bare hand pointed at the woman, and fire seemed to just explode right out of it. I didn't bother to think about how that was happening. Not at the time. I was a little busy. I got my gun up around the time he half turned to face me, keeping the stream of fire on the screaming, thrashing maid. His other arm rose, hand pointed at me. A lot of things ran through my head in that moment. Old skills I hadn't had to use much in some time. Returned with a vengeance. Sometimes, as it turns out, killing really is like riding a bike. A murdery, poorly constructed analogy of a bike. Anyway. My eyes moved almost on their own. He wasn't wearing body armor. He was muscled, but not excessively. The tattoos weren't military. He didn't have the eyes of a military man. They were wide, electric blue, slightly bloodshot, panicked, and at the same time, focused. Even so, I clearly had him by surprise. Fire erupted from his palm about the time I sighted up between those eyes from less than 10 feet away, and pulled the trigger twice in a calm, measured pair. I then did what any logical person would do when a gigantic gout of flame is coming at you, and I threw myself to the side. It singed my right shoulder and washed the right side of my face in scorching heat. It didn't burn me bad. I'd feel it in the morning, but none of it did any real damage. I hit in a roll, came up in a crouch with my aim set. The man's corpse hit the floor pretty much about the time that my gun sighted on him. The maid slumped sideways onto the floor. Dead or alive, I wasn't sure. I hoped dead. She looked like charcoal on the front side of her body, and I know it sounds horrible that I wished she was dead, but, I mean, sometimes dead is better. That was one of those times. What the fuck just happened? I asked. No one answered, so I decided to ask the corpse a little more indirectly. Without the balaclava, he looked like a relatively average man. White 25 at most, brown hair, stubble. Tattoos continued all the way up his arms onto his torso, odd arcane symbols that made no real sense at the time, and considering the house was fucking burning, it was a cursory inspection at best. But I filed them away in my head for later, what of them I could. The stupid bastard had somehow pulled one over on me, though. I couldn't find the device he had used to burn the fucking parents and the maid and ruin my coat. It didn't make sense to me, but my mind said he had to have used some kind of chemical weapon or something. There wasn't time for me to keep feeling up the dead. The corner of the room the maid had been backed into was already burning good and hard from the constant stream of fire washing over it. Considering the wife had her own impressively stocked liquor cabinet next to her desk and the fire was chewing towards it at an alarming rate, I had to get all of the fuck out. I checked the duffel bag, hoping the clothing wrapped around the laptop had protected it. With the parents dead, it was my only link to Melissa. Once I made sure that it was still there and seemed to be intact, I got the hell up, policed my brass as an old habit, picking up my shells, and headed for the door. I'd done a walk through the house when I got there, so I had a good idea of where to go and where the explosion had come from. I hung a right and sprinted down the hall. The bottom floor was already burning hard, if the stickiness of the varnish or wax was anything to judge by. Oh, right. Also, it was hotter than hell in summer, and the air was getting thick as shit with smoke. So that tends to be a fairly good indicator. But it meant the bottom floor was probably a goddamn inferno. And my time was shorter than before. These people were using flamethrowers of some kind, or else some some chemical. I knew I had to move fast. The lower I got, the worse the smoke got. I kept low, running in a crouch, cursing the fact that I was a borderline giant. It made it extremely hard to get low and keep speed. The end of the hall, facing away from the stairs, was a wall of fire. Something groaned and crunched above me, and debris started falling around me, which in any kind of house fire that you happen to be inside of is generally considered, I think, bad fucking news. So I headed for the kitchen door at the other end of the hall and barreled through it into a kitchen to find 2 human-sized cinders on the floor. They were the cooks, halfway through preparing dinner, which, ironically, smelled like it was burning. They were dead, obviously. Also, I don't think that's even how you use the word irony. I gritted my teeth and I headed for the security door leading out in the garage. About the time I realized that the security door was standing open, I realized there was a black-clothed figure in the garage with his back to me. Instead of fucking about, I did the smart thing. I brought my gun up and I shot him twice in the back. It's not pretty and it's not honorable. These people were equipped way better than I would have expected anybody in that city to be. Which I guess should just show you how naive I was back then. He went down hard and fast, probably because 10mm bullets are actually pretty sizable, and I think I hit him in the spine. I stalked into the garage. It stunk like gasoline. Sitting on the floor next to the guy I murdered was a jerry can on its side, emptying its contents onto the floor, meaning that my escape from the garage was extra fucking time sensitive. Previously, he had been emptying it onto the convertible that the wife drove to and from work, you know. The SUV the husband drove was already sodden. Everything seemed to be going great until something hit me like a truck, throwing me behind the partially soaked SUV. It caught me under my arm because, I had my gun up in a shooter stance. So, right in the ribcage. I hadn't been hit like that since I was younger and a Jeep rammed me. And either that impact or the impact on the ground broke one of my ribs. My brain registered the ugly internal crunch, but not when it happened. I was too dazed. Sort of hit me afterwards, that wet break sound. I went up on my side, duffel bag a few feet away. But I'm quick for a big guy. I got to my feet just in time for something to hit me again, hard enough to drive me back against the car. Now here's where things get weird. I was thrown into that car hard enough to dent the door inward and shatter the window. I had never thought about my capability to take heavy hits like that before. And in that moment, I tried to for a split second, and something forced me to turn my thoughts elsewhere. Also, the broken rib flexed and my vision went dark around the edges because that fucking hurts. I don't care who the fuck you are. Broken ribs are the shittiest. The only thing worse is a broken collarbone. There was another man in the garage. He was the one who hit me, dressed the same as all of the rest. He came at me with his fist raised, and I realized that somehow this fucking 6'1" son of a bastard bitch had literally driven his shoulder into me the first time he threw me. And then he had straight up just pushed me the second time, like a middle schooler trying to have a fight with someone. Somehow he was strong, though, too strong, too fast. I managed to get the fuck out of the dent in the SUV and ducked to the side as he threw a punch. His fist slammed into the metal and just sunk in with this horribly loud, awful crunching noise that shouldn't have been possible, and then I shot him twice in the side of the head. Because strong or not, the stupid bastard had too high an opinion of himself, and he left himself totally exposed. I didn't bother pulling his balaclava off on account of the fact that I didn't like the idea of burning to death. I just shrugged out of my gasoline-dampened coat, because I hit the floor in the SUV, you see. shrugged out of my button-down and tugged off my undershirt. And then I pulled on a spare shirt from my bag and dumped a bottle of water over myself, rinsing my silvery-ish, grayish, whitish hair and everything else. If nothing else, it'd keep me from catching fire when I left. And I was going to leave. Believe me. I just had to collect my brass as fast as I could, dump the casings into my bag, and then make my way to my vehicle, hoping it wasn't also soaked in gasoline. I got lucky. I caught them before they covered my trike. Don't you goddamn dare judge me for having a three-wheeled motorcycle, alright? I needed a big vehicle that could make highway speed, support my weight, and carry my ready bag in case I had to run like hell away from everything really fast, and also I liked motorcycles. The engine was big, the bike was big, I was big, it was a theme. And it was a trike, damn it. Custom built by some people I did work for when I first came to the city. Don't judge me. But it also wasn't soaked in gasoline, which just proves that someone out there in the Pantheon still thinks I'm halfway worthwhile. It was high time to get the hell out of Dodge, and as fast as I could before I got neck deep in all kinds of extra trouble. Breathing hurt like hell, my back ached, my ribs screamed with every motion of my torso. It felt just like the old days. The hard days, the life or death days. Time was up, the garage door was open, and I was not going to get another good chance. I don't know. It's hard thinking back on this. It's hard. Either way. I dug a special piece of equipment out of my bag and secured it, or rather them, around my face. Goggles, lens dark and reflective, especially made, a little party favor I had when I fled my old life. The other piece of special equipment came out, and then I tugged the pin, pulled my arm back, and pitched it into the blackness. About a second later, I gunned the engine and pulled through the open door. And then for a second it was brighter than daytime in front of me. Even with the goggles, I had to turn my head to the side to avoid being dazzled for a full, second and a half. It wasn't a flash. It was a burn. They called them solar flare grenades. Go figure. The men out in the front yard were not quite so lucky. Without so much as a hint of hesitation, I picked up speed and rode up the driveway, and as I went, I pulled the goggles off and stuffed them in my bag, because, for me, I wasn't blind and it was still nighttime. Those people were still recovering from the stolen solar flare grenade. Yes, I stole it. It was experimental tech, like I said. My employer was working on it. It got dropped because it had a tendency to accidentally blind the people using it. Who'da thunk? And then, the goggles came along and they picked it back up again. But point is, they were all blind. Fuck them. It felt good to get going fast and have a reason for it. Up ahead, the front gate was standing open. It looked like they had just opened it, just unlocked it, ignored the code, or maybe found what the code was. I don't know. I didn't know. I felt like I should have heard the gate opening, or I felt like I was getting rusty, and I blamed myself. But I couldn't have possibly gotten rusty. It was a violent city. I didn't want to believe it. But I wasn't as young as I once was. It was a different kind of war zone in Blackwood. Things moved and shook differently. A lot of things happened in Blackwood that I didn't understand and didn't try to understand because I was trying not to wind up in the ugly business again. 2 men flanked the gate. I had enough stability to put one down. The other sent a gout of fire roaring at me that did not move like fire or gasoline. Fire, it disperses. Gasoline, it arcs. Napalm arcs, too. You can't just point a flamethrower and always hit your target in a straight line. It's not a fucking death ray. This guy was 100 yards away and he nearly took my head off in a straight shot. I was lucky to get low and dodge the blast. If my shirt wasn't soaked and my skin and hair wasn't wet, I'd have suffered worse burns along my back than the minor streak I got. Still, it hurt like a son of a bitch. I bet if he didn't die real fast, on account of the fact that I shot him 4 times in the chest, the whole getting shot 4 times in the chest thing would have hurt real bad. Would have hurt a little more if the rounds weren't subsonic, but, well, maybe it wouldn't have. I don't know. Someday I'll have to shoot someone with one of each and ask. Either way, I made it out onto the road and skidded into an awkward turn to the right. Now see, sometimes I make dumb decisions. Sometimes I do dumb shit for good reasons. I was all done being dumb for the night. As soon as I had good traction and was no longer skidding, I swerved to the side again. See, they were smart enough to have 2 men in the garage. I had no doubt they were smart enough to have more than 2 men on the gate. But nothing happened. No lights bloomed behind me. My mirrors didn't show me anybody rushing down the road towards me. From behind, that is. I don't know. I don't know why I was only looking behind me. But a cold sensation of dread washed over me as I stared into the mirror. Instantly, I turned my attention forward. It wasn't a particularly often traveled road, except by the rich people who lived on it, being that it was so far outside the city. And of course it was nearly 2 in the morning, so there were no cars, no one was driving that way. As soon as I turned my eyes forward, a man seemed to melt out of the darkness ahead and throw his arm out at me, as if he was going to do that gout of fire, flamethrower, shooty thing like the rest of them did. I swerved again, though my swerving capacity wasn't quite as much as your average motorcycle, even if it was better than your average car. Horrible, ungodly pain, like I hadn't felt in a long time, bloomed on my right side. It seemed to spread bolts of white lightning screaming through my nervous system. Enraged, and better than most at taking pain, I emptied the rest of my gun at him. I definitely even tagged his shoulder. I saw the spray of blood, a little bit at least. It was pure luck, make no mistake. If I didn't get lucky there, he'd have killed me cold. Even so, the shot that clipped him was enough that he had to throw himself to the side. Or maybe he did it out of shock. Either way, I roared past him. The world was starting to get a little hazy, but I remember his eyes when I looked to the side. He was absolutely filled to the brim with a seething, screaming hatred of the highest caliber, all directed at me. I stared back, likely looking a lot more shocked and frightened than he was, and, frankly, with good reason. Looked to me like I had just made a new enemy, so I pushed the engine as hard as I could and tried not to black out from the pain while I rode.